Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another program of One on One. And if you have seen our program before, we always invite prominent individuals in the community, very successful in whatever field that they have been in. Hence, we invite them to the program to talk about their achievements, what kind of, what have they given back to the community. And today's guest is none other than Abdul Hai, who's an OBE recipient, who is also a former Camden councilor and cabinet member, who's been a community activist for the last 20 odd years, 25 years. So I'd like to welcome you, Abdul Hai, to the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Right, first of all, before we go in depth about your achievements in this field, how did it feel to receive an OBE, especially after leaving the post that you've been in for so long?
I mean, it was a real honor to receive an OBE from the late Queen for services to young people in Camden and the community in London. And for me, it was such a humbling experience because, you know, to be acknowledged for your work and your dedication. And I think I'm a great believer that in serving the community isn't about what you achieve for me, it's about what you give in the name of public services. And for me, it's about the difference that I made, or my intention was to serve the community and try making a positive impact in the day-to-day lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, well-deserved the achievement and the being a recipient of the OBE. Now, you grew up in social housing in central London, also been to the local schools and so forth. Was it from a young age that you wanted to, embark on the journey of politics, or is it something it came later on after seeing the ups and downs of your, surroundings?
I mean, I grew up in Camden as a young person and went to the local schools, and from a young age, I've seen, that time I think Camden, the Bangladeshis were the second largest community, and there were elements of challenges in public services, from housing to health to discrimination, elements of racism. And I always felt that one should be treated based on the merits, not because of color of the skin. And there were elements of services which local government did not really understand our communities. So as I sort of grew up and as I left school, and there was a profound reminder there are lots of things weren't right, and I got involved with youth and community work for a charity based in King's Cross. Right. And through that work, I was able to work with local police, work with the council, work with councillors, work with policy makers, and there was huge underrepresentation, particularly for young people in our communities, but also the wider community. Yeah. For various reasons. The services weren't aligned to meeting their needs. So for example, British Bangladeshis come from a large extended families. That's so right, when the council were making social housings, they weren't making 4 or 5 bedrooms, they're making 2 or 3 beds. That's so right. It wasn't compatible. It wasn't compatible for our communities, but also housing is such an important base. If you have a good housing, it provides a foundation for children to learn, to go to school, to do their homework, also provides family a space to interact. And if you've got poor housing, has an impact on your children's education attainment, has an impact on your health, your mental health, but also the negative impact does impact your career progressions.
Yeah. I mean, education is a key factor in one's life, from a very, very young age. And as you mentioned, if the right kind of housing is not provided and the facilities are not provided, then it's a chain reaction for a child's education. So, yeah, absolutely right. You've been in community work as well from a very young age. What you just mentioned now, was it straight after you left school, secondary school, or is it while you were going to college when you started your community work?
I think it's, in my early sort of late teens, I've seen and experienced elements of discrimination. There was a lot of injustice. There was issues around not just housing, jobs, training. And I felt certain sections of our communities were held back, and something needed to be done, or someone needed to work and make sure that opportunities were given to the whole section of our communities. And through that work, I worked with the charity, and through that work, I was able to work with the council to organize work placement for Bangladeshis or Black and Asian kids, so that they'll have experience working for local government. I was involved with Camden Bangladesh Mela from I think probably sort of late 1990s, and I helped and shaped at the youth event, which is quite a big feature now. Also, I got involved in, kind of chairing various different panels to look at stop and search, to look at sort of how young people are treated.
But these were obviously later on as you pursued in your career. But, a lot of us, we see these, differences as we're growing up. But obviously, it must have affected you for you to take those steps and try to make a difference.
I think having seen your elders and how the community went through the journey, and I'm sure you will recall from your experience of growing up in Camden, there are lots of
in the 80s and
the 80s. There are segregations. There are issues around integrations. Also, integration doesn't mean that you let go of your heritage and culture. Integration means it's about communities coming together and coexistence and tolerance and understanding, celebrating each other's culture in harmony. And these are the things I tried to do, is to promote community cohesion and tolerance, but at the same time recognizing our difference as a strength, not a weakness.
Absolutely. And so I mean, in the 1990s, or you joined the Labour Party, and obviously you were recognizing that only the Labour Party could make a difference in terms of health and social care, especially for the ethnic minority. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I joined the Labour Party sort of late 1990s, and the reason being is that there are lots of different political parties, but for me, Labour Party appealed to me because Labour Party believed in social justice and tackling inequality, and for me, that resonated with my beliefs and values. And those values I tried taking forward as a Labour activist. I worked with Labour Party
members. You believed, obviously, I mean, whatever party you may be involved in, first of all, you've got to have that belief inside yourself, the belief that you've got to join a certain organization to make that difference. But first of all, it must have been embedded in you, or as you were growing up, you saw the inequalities and the differences from the from our community, or the ethnic minority and the mainstream communities. So you saw the difference, and you must have had that in you from a very young age to join any organization. And obviously at that time you saw that Labour Party were appealed to you in terms of they would be able to make that difference, or you being with that party, you'll be able to make that difference in the community. Am I right?
I mean, yeah, Sarif, just to say, if you want to make difference, you don't just, through political parties you can influence, but there may be different channels. I'm not just saying that, just if you want to change, you have to get involved in politics. Or politics may be a path, there may be different avenues and different channels. But for me,
you as an individual you wanted to make that change
but
because
for me,
you saw the differences.
The Labour values resonated with my values of someone that came from a Black and Asian background. I've seen the injustice around housing, to health, to jobs, and how certain communities were being discriminated. And I felt Labour Party provided that value, and that value set's really connected with me. And as a result of my community work, and I realized that I got to a point where I was asking questions. Well, why is this service designed in this particular way? Which means that you're not catering for a certain section of the communities. There may be unconscious bias, there may be systematic discrimination, but just to be clear, that discriminating is one thing, and the system is designed. So it's not designed in elements of with an intent of racism, but the system failed to understand the need of certain communities, and that system designed the service in a particular way that had a knock-on impact on certain section of our communities, including the British Bangladeshi community. At that point, I felt that in order to change policies and influence them, I decided that maybe I wanted to become a councillor, because quite a few people have said to me that perhaps I should consider becoming councillor. As a result, I put myself forward.
Because of the activities that you took on,
yes.
you know, people felt like if you, became a councillor, you could, enhance in that or in those activities. Is that
yes,
right?
I think there's a profound belief with individuals who are already councillors or former councillors who suggested perhaps through various different avenues and different forums where I was involved in Camden across Pan London, and I was asking those questions, and sometimes the decision makers weren't able to respond to those questions, and they said, "Oh, perhaps you should put yourself forward. Perhaps if you are a decision maker, perhaps you can change something or have some positive influence." And as a result of that, I've decided to put myself for local government, and I was elected as a councillor in 2006. By that time, Labour administration was in opposition. So Labour reclaimed the council in 2010. I was the chair of the Labour group from 2009 to 2010, where we had a brilliant manifesto. Then we became in administration, and since then, I held from 2010 to 2022. I held a number of cabinet portfolios, which meant I had various different responsibilities. And just to give an example, through those cabinet roles, I introduced various different services, particularly meeting our needs of our communities. One of the things that I did when I was in charge of leisure services, I introduced Muslim women swimming session. Because a lot of Muslim women, even though they wanted to engage with access services, but one has to respect the cultural and religious needs. And I think within a reasonable means, you could provide those services. So I introduced women-only swimming sessions to meet those needs of the community. I also co-chaired the Camden Faith Leaders Forum from 2014 to 2022, where I brought the Muslim, Jewish, Christian faith non-communities to work together to look at challenges of hate crime, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. I was the person who introduced motions through full council to adopt the all-party parliamentary working group definition of Islamophobia, same as the definition of the anti-Semitism, because it's about educating our communities, also making people aware of the impact on hate crimes, and people are being discriminated because of their belief and values. So I've tried influencing those. I mean, I worked from 2011 and 12 to try modernizing bringing the coroner service to 21st century. So the coroner service is when someone dies, has an impact. Depending how you die, some cases are referred to the coroner. When cases are referred to the coroner, it's quite a complex process. So I worked with the community to understand the services. I was a lead member for Camden, Islington, Tower Hamlets and Hackney. And they realized that the service did not meet the needs of the community. So if someone died during bank holiday weekend, there was no service to deal with post-mortem.
It's a little bit different for our community, especially the Muslim community and the Jewish community. It's quite similar. That there's a few processes that the body needs to go through, and burial needs to take place very quick. I mean, thank you for mentioning that. I was going to actually mention that as one of the important roles that you took or you introduced. That was later on in your life of politics. If I can remember correctly. But so this made a huge difference to our community, and it helped us as well, and also at the same time educated the non-Muslims in the requirements for when somebody passed away. So carry on.
So with the coroner services, that the way the service was designed, so the belief particularly for faith communities, the Jewish community or Muslim community, someone dies, our belief is that we should be buried as soon as possible.
That's right.
Plus, there should be non-invasive post-mortem, not a physical one.
Right.
And sometimes bodies were held up. So I worked with the chief coroner. I worked with successive chief coroners for them to give guidelines to coroners across the country about making sure the release of the deceased bodies to the families, but also understanding the cultural needs, making sure the service is much more compassionate. So because of those services, the government did a review in 2015 looking at the coronal services. I worked with successive cross-party House of Lords, MPs across the country to lobby and try and bring in about the changes. In 2018, I supported a campaign. There was a ruling in the High Court, and what the senior judges have said basically is that all coroners across England and Wales have to have a localised prioritization policy. What that means in practice, that if you're a person of faith, you can say, look, because of my faith, I would like you to consider my deceased body as a matter of urgency. So it's not about jumping the queue. It's just like going to a hospital. You may have gone to the A&E first, but there may have been someone else back of the queue, probably had a heart attack.
Right.
But if you say, well, everyone should be first come, first served, that narrative doesn't make sense.
No.
So
because some may have, a more they might be in a more dire situation to be looked at than somebody else.
So in the same way that if you look at the Equality Act talks about making sure that minority rights are protected. Right. So I've argued, based on the Equalities Act, that the minority rights should be protected. As a result, the High Court ruling was that in England and Wales, there'll be localised prioritisation policy, which means that you can demand, say, look, my case should be considered because of my faith or because of my culture. I also...
so they prioritise those cases. But I mean, obviously there are regulations that are in place, and we're not here to discuss the government regulations with regards to...
But just an example
But how difficult was it, or how easy was it for you to, put that in motion?
It took, basically, I started the work in 2011. It took almost over 10 years working with successive government ministers, cross MPs, worked with Keir Starmer, worked with
Emily I posed the question because,
I worked with Rushnara Ali, the MP for Bethnal Green and Bow, I believe. And Rushnara was quite prominent. She helped me with those campaigns. I worked with Simon Hughes. I worked with Michael Gove. To be honest, Michael Gove was quite receptive to the needs of those communities. So it took quite a lot of time. But fundamentally, I worked with the Jewish community quite closely, and they helped to
they understood. They understood. I mean, there are similarities between the Islamic faith and the Jewish faith, especially when it comes to a deceased person. And that's why I posed the question, because it's like changing a whole system. When it comes to the coroners, rules and regulations. So well done to you for that, and it was a successful task at the end of the day.
Yes, but there's still more to be done. But I believe that obviously I stepped down from the council this May because I wanted to. I felt after serving for 16 years, people talked about changes. If we all stay in the same position, I always believe good to have changes because changes bring about different personalities, and you become much more progressive, and also you bring talent, new generation of people that can come to the council, can bring innovation, can bring ideas. And so I felt after serving 16 years, I want to do something different. But just on the coroner service, I think I introduced out-of-hours services in Camden, and it's down to sort of North London Consortium, which consists of Camden, Islington, Hamlets, and Hackney, and I think similar services have been introduced across the country. But at least we have a framework in place to deal with when someone dies. I also produced a booklet which the Ministry of Justice, MOJ, has seen as a good practice, so they've shared it across the country. So that talks about sort of, someone dies, what happens, what do you need to do, what are the scenarios if you die in hospital, if you die at home. So it gives people a brief information for them to understand, because if someone dies, it's quite a difficult time for you to process the death, deal with emotions, but also try dealing with the administrative side of processing necessary paperwork.
Many aspects to, when a family loses a loved one, and then obviously the loved one is gone, but there are, processes that needs to be taking places, and also with regards to the cultural background and religion. Now, as an elected councillor, going back to 2006, what were your key focuses that when I enter this position, then these are the things that I'll be looking to change. But at the same time, you have to work with your peers. How difficult or easy was that? How did you find that?
It was a juggle between, so when I was elected in 2006, I had a full-time job. So I was doing a full-time job. On top of that, you would have meetings in the evenings,
right.
council functions, and then you have to do surgery, some meetings during daytime. So you had to sort of, work around, which was quite challenging. But when I went to the council, I think my focus was to ensure that making local government legitimate,
right.
in the eyes of the public, and making sure that you are serving their interest.
Yeah.
So that was my kind of primary objective.
Right.
Once you went into the council, as a councillor, depending on your role, you could be a cabinet member, you could be a backbencher, you could be a scrutiny. There's different roles.
Yeah.
Within those roles, you can still look at services. So, my focus has always been about tackling social injustice and inequalities.
Right.
So some of the work that
because these are the things that you
these
saw
are areas that I felt
right.
passionate.
We were talking about as when you were elected councillor since 2006. What are the targets that you had? What kind of differences that you made? And you mentioned a few things about, obviously, with regards to community, social needs, especially with our ethnic background, and that the mainstream communities, they have not recognized the needs of for example, you talked about coroners services and so forth. Carry on with what you're saying. But just going back with the coroner service, how much have we gone, in terms of the whole change being made, and are they addressing all that correctly?
So we've made a significant progress. It took a lot of work, and also I want to sort of acknowledge, lots of British Bangladeshi broadcasters also were quite involved, as well as our wider communities, MPs, House of Lords. So with the coroner service, at least at a stage where if you die, you can ask for prioritization. So you can ask not necessarily fast track, but making sure that if someone dies, you can say, well, based on my faith and my cultural needs, can my deceased body be looked into quite urgently? That's more or less agreed with coroners across England and Wales. Second point is around non-invasive post-mortem.
That's right. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
So the non-invasive post-mortem, you can ask the coroner for a non-invasive post-mortem. What I've done with the successive chief coroners and Ministry of Justice, I made an argument that people, based on people's religious needs, so both with the Jewish and Muslim community, you believe is that you should be buried the way you were born, without your body being physically touched or physical post-mortem. So most coroners would give you choice of non-invasive post-mortem.
Right.
But just to bear in mind that there is a cost involved. You have to pay for that non-invasive post-mortem.
Okay.
That's,
right.
Whereas it's not free.
Right.
And the second point is, even if you did a non-invasive post-mortem, these are coroner service, quite technical area. So the coroner still he or she has the rights to override the finding of the non-invasive post-mortem.
Right, okay.
But those things you can get in touch with your coroner. But the
so
fact
I was going to ask you, because obviously post-mortem is a regulation that they have to carry out. When can they disregard that because of the request from...
So the one fundamental point one has to remember, that coroner has two fundamental functions.
Right.
One is to establish cause of death and to prevent future deaths. And that's why the coroners tend to take inquest. So it is, depending on the circumstances, obviously we want to have sufficient time to explain all of that. And the second point is that I don't have legal expertise, but I think, having spent 12 years, I think I have a reasonable understanding of the complexity of the services. So depending on the circumstances, how you die, where you die. So if you died at home, you didn't have any medical conditions, it's most likely that there has to be a post-mortem.
Right,
if you're a young person under 40 or 50, suddenly you died at home, you had a heart attack, most likely has to be referred to the coroner. But it's, you know, you can take guidelines from the coroner, and he or she will explain reason for post-mortem. Yes,
I understand. Okay, well, thank you. I mean, look, at the end of the day, you know, these are noble tasks and you know, betterment of the community. Now, you've been involved with something called the Youth Safety Task Force.
Yes.
For the past many years.
Yes.
And if I'm correct, that's not recent, is it?
No.
You've been involved in that for a while. What does that involve?
So in 2017, when I was a lead cabinet member for community safety and in charge of services for young people, Camden youth violence was the highest in London. Whereas Camden, normally amongst youth violence, it's sort of on the average bottom at the bottom league of things. One time, you know, basically the murder rate was so high, it was becoming alarming. So I set up a task force with a local MP, Sir Keir Starmer, and we got together a group of experts, people from various different fields, people from schools.
Who's the opposition leader now?
He's the leader of the Labour Party. Both Keir and I chaired the Youth Safety Task Force to understand the causes of knife crime and how can we prevent causes of knife crime. So we took evidence from experts, young people, professional health and so on. And we came up with the 17 recommendation. Primary focus of the Youth Safety Task Force was to take a community lens approach, looking at health and trauma.
Right.
So we delivered health and trauma practices in schools. And one of the things that came quite clearly from the investigation is that 1/3 of people involved in youth violence either came from domestic violence, substance misuse, drugs, or they were leaving schools early with no qualifications, truanting, and so on. So that was a clear lens. So in youth violence, you have both the young people who are perpetrators, but also the victims.
Right.
So we took a community approach. We delivered a project through £500,000, funded various different projects. We also looked at the under 18 to 25. There was a gap in that services. We tried addressing them through jobs and trainings. And we also developed a number of initiatives. One of the initiatives it's called Red Thread, a project which works in hospitals. So when young people are involved in knife crimes, or if they've been stabbed and so on, there is a specialist team that can work with families to ensure that, you know, they could be offered safety and so on, and alternative accommodation. And there's a number of other projects that we delivered, including one in sort of when people are arrested. It's called Engage, and the purpose of the project is to have professional youth workers and practitioners working with young people, because that's in a space where they may be held in cells for 5-6 hours, and maybe an opportunity to find an alternative path. And the idea is to work with the families to find an alternative path. I mean, Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, because success of the project, he's invested 3 million across Pan London. There are a number of local authorities across the country following our model of youth safety model, of the way we've taken the approach of bringing all these different partners together and see where are the gaps and what can we do to keep young people safe. Touch wood that the number of knife crimes or youth violence has gone down in Camden, but we're still working towards more targeted outcomes.
Have you
just despite Keir Starmer, who's the leader of the Labour Party, despite him being really busy, he still makes time for Youth Safety Task Force. So both Keir and I continue to co-chair the Youth Safety Task Force. But that shows about his commitment.
But many of these knife crimes, I mean, have you found them to be gang-related? And then, obviously, if it is gang-related, it sometimes, you know, it extends not just to one victim, but to more than one.
Yes, it's quite a complex. There are elements of gangs, grooming, exploitations, county lines. So county lines where they used youngsters to kind of transport drugs from one city to another city. So it's the whole thing is quite a complex. So the key thing is it's kind of, you know, working from an early age. Early intervention is so important. Identifying families or children who are at risk. So we worked with one of the college and a school to develop a early intervention alert system, a model where you identify a matrix, where you identify young people who could be risk of youth violence, and the idea is to make this. So we've got a number of different initiatives. Also, the Right Honourable Ian Duncan Smith, obviously he's from a Conservative, and I've been told that he was closely looking at some of the work that we did. He's involved in the think tank.
Okay, all right, fantastic. Okay, now during the COVID-19, also there are a few investigations that you took part in. What was your involvement in that?
So you know, because of my role, and I became aware of that Black and Asian people are disproportionately dying from COVID.
That's right.
And the data was suggesting more death amongst Black and Asian people, particularly in Bangladeshis, were amongst
the high risk,
twice more likely to die from COVID than the counterparts. That was very concerning. So again, I pulled together a professionals, people from health to different services within Camden to volunteer sector, to look at sort of what can we do. So I undertook a rapid 6 weeks investigation, looking at from health to housing to education to looking at frontline workers. And what came out is the structural inequalities. The reason that Black and Asian people are dying because they tend to be more frontline workers, like bus drivers, nurses. So they were more exposed to COVID because they're frontline workers. There's issues around.
Did we call them key workers as well?
Yes, yes. There are issues about housing. So if one person had COVID, there was no space, even though the advice was to isolate. Well, if you live in an extended family of 5 or 6 or 7, if you live in a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom, where are you supposed to isolate? So all of those factors disproportionately impacted. So as a result, we put emergency measures where Black and Asian families could go into separate housings. We looked at sort of what can we do to look at the education, to look at health. We made changes, and as a result of that work, we looked at a key finding from that report came around. Is a report called, read it and you get a chance, called Building Equal Foundations. Basically, there was structural inequalities. Because of the structural inequalities, Black and Asian people were dying,
and this goes back.
And the whole thing isn't just about council services. It is a national issue from university. So, for example, like during the lockdown, exam results. If you're a Black and Asian person, people are marking your paperwork. They'll mark you down
because you're from a Black and Asian background.
So same with jobs. So the whole society, when I looked at the whole thing from position of power, decision makers, the whole thing was against Black and Asian people. So there were elements of conscious and unconscious bias. There was systematic discrimination. So it's not, so the system wasn't designed to say, well, we want to discriminate Black and Asian people. But the way it was designed, it excluded.
So would you call that unconscious bias?
I call that unconscious bias, and that's why we need a more of a holistic approach. And so some of those changes. So like we introduced Black curriculum in our schools. We made sure that during the lockdown, people with Black and Asian people were given laptops to study from home. These are early interventions we've made. We looked at like social care services, like care homes. Again, there was elements of discrimination. We had a protocol with care homes where they're going to be educating people around discrimination and racism. So there are a number of changes, and I think that piece of work was used as a good practice by local government association. So that's a piece of work that I was really proud of. But one of the things I called up on various different people with parliamentary level is that there's no point producing reports. What you need is a cross-party working group with proper mandate and looking at structural inequalities across both the public and private sector. Because the last thing we want to do is, for us, and it needs to be a continuing process, because if we make progress now, and if that's not continued, well, the difficulties are, we go through a phase like mid-90s, there was elements of being anti-racist, but we made good progress. In the same way with structural dealing with structural inequalities is that it is a continuing process.
Absolutely.
Because if we don't keep on making that if we make progress, and then
you've got to start somewhere to make that change.
And then we start again.
And what I was going to say is the whole system is in this, situation is because of going back in the early stages where they created this system of housing and education and segregation, for example, what you mentioned earlier on. And hence we have, got ourselves involved when the pandemic was here. It affected the Black and Asian minorities.
But what the pandemic really highlighted, Sean, highlighted is that how unequal our society is, and that really exposed it, really brought it to life, that people were dying from Black and Asian background because of the way our public services and are designed. The point that I wanted to make is that even though it needs to be a continuum process, but the baton needs to be passed on to a next generation. The problem is that you make good stride, then you have new decision makers coming through, and then it's like taking 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. And the last thing we want to do is our children saying to us 20 years time, or our grandchildren saying to us, well, what have you done for us? Instead of me focusing on what can I achieve or my abilities, why should I be dealing with structural inequalities? It should be a plain level field. And that's something that we've got to remember.
Okay, fantastic. So, many of these, aspects took place and we faced a lot of difficulties during the COVID-19. But it's a good thing that people like yourself working with, other leaders and took the initiative of making those changes and investigating why, especially our, people from our background, and especially the Black and Asian minority, and they face that. And as you mentioned, changes, they needed to be taken place, earlier on, but there's a start somewhere.
But can I also say that I want to be grateful to our British Bangladeshi communities. I remember going into various different channels to raise the issue, our community leaders, faith groups, people from our community, produce videotapes encouraging people about taking measures. People also took vaccination, because getting vaccinated was the right thing to do, and that's something that I promoted. So our communities responded to the call to action, yes.
Brilliant. Now, recently, there's something else that you was involved in, very interesting, and I've written it down as, statue of the Memorial Working Group, and this was involved in erecting statues, if I'm not mistaken, and I've got something, I've got Gandhi written here as well. So, what was that all about?
So after the Black Lives Matters in America, after the unfortunate death
when they took down a lot of statues,
George Floyd, there was demonstration across the world. There was a sentiment that Black people were being discriminated and how unequal this society was, and the elements around slavery and everything else. And so I undertook. I led a cross-party working group, set up a terms of reference for Statue and Memorial Working Group. The question that we asked, rather than going into detail, are those statues and memorial conducive to our values that we share now? So Cecil Rhodes, who was a famous slave trader in South Africa, in his hands, thousands of Black people died, were enslaved. And to have his building still there to remind us of the injustice that took place. So we set up a framework, and we reviewed like Karl Marx statue, we reviewed Gandhi's statue, but we looked at sort of the contribution they made versus a negative impact. On balance,
so there was no erection of statues.
So there wasn't, but the only one that we renamed, we renamed Cecil Rhodes House because of his direct involvement in slave trade. We felt this wasn't conducive to our values, so that building was renamed. We worked with the residents to rename, and what we did with the other statues is that we're gonna. Obviously I left now, but I left a framework, and the framework was that we was going to design a QR code. So you know QR code, you can scan it, and we was going to work with historians and so on. So there may be a statue of Gandhi, there may be a statue of Karl Marx. So you can go next to the statue,
scan the QR code, and get all the information.
We'll work with historians and people with expertise, contextualized about those individuals, so that readers can make an informed decision about what they did, rather than removing statues. It's not about raiding history, but history needs to be told in what may have been kind of acceptable 100, 200 years ago, might not be acceptable now, but it's to contextualize that in that sense.
Yeah, I understand. And also this started off in
and
the
also
USA.
So the other thing I also did, and I think quite a number of local authorities are following that, I left a draft public realm policy. So the idea of a public realm policy is that our street names, our building names, our parks, open space needs to reflect our communities, our diverse communities. So, if you look at London population, 1/3 of it for Black and Asian background, well, shouldn't our parks names, shouldn't our building names, shouldn't our plaques, shouldn't our street names reflecting of our communities? That's how you promote tolerance and understanding, acceptance. So that's something that my colleagues will be taking forward now.
So just elaborate on that a little bit. Like we've got Whitechapel now, which is in Bengali as well. And there are other places that they have remembrance of a certain individual or something. So is that what you want to carry on, or is that a framework that you left behind?
There's a framework of public realm policy that when we, so for example, we had the first Muslim person, a building was named after her, because as a result of the work that I did. So there was like a large housing scheme the council was developing. We worked with a resident because we wanted to make sure the buildings were reflected, but we went through a democratic process where we talked about this individual. So there was an engagement process where people that who lived in the states, or the states which was regenerated or redeveloped, people involved in naming those individuals.
I mean, so there's a lot of significance.
We went through a more of a engaging process, but surely, our street names and our statues and public spaces needs to reflect our community.
So are we going to be looking at a few changes?
So in Camden, there's a policy, public realm policy being developed, and you will hopefully you will see more names of our diverse communities, and that model, sort of process. I think there's few boroughs across the country who are looking at the model, but obviously every local authority has to come up with a tailor-made policy that meets the locality, if you see what I mean.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Abdul Hai, OBE. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming to the show and sharing all this that you've shared with us, and a great achievement, and well-deserved recipient of this title at the moment. Do you have any? What's the future looking for you, or how are you looking at the future in terms of getting involved in politics again?
So I think I'm still politically engaged. It's just that I'm not a councillor, so I'm working with a number of MPs, number of shadow ministers. I still continue to co-chair the Youth Safety Task Force with the Right Honourable Keir Starmer, who's the leader of Labour Party, and also with Keir, I worked with him very closely. I was part of his internal selection for him becoming a parliamentary candidate for Labour Party. I was part of his core group.
So you're just taking a little break before you go back into politics again in a higher scale?
Well, I'm still engaged, and obviously if the opportunity comes, then I'll consider it. But I'm still engaging. I'm just working in working from a different kind of angle, but I'm still involved politically, and I'm politically still engaged.
Fantastic. Well, that was my last question. I was going to wrap it up earlier on, but just clicked in my mind just to ask you what the future holds for you, or how you're looking at it. Once again, thank you, Abdul Hai, for coming to the show. And just for the viewers, you've seen the achievements of Abdul from a very young age. He's been involved in social justice, and he's seen a lot of inequalities in the community, made a lot of differences, and for the better, and especially for our Black and Asian minority the groups, and also worked with police and the safety task force, knife crimes, and so forth. So I hope you enjoyed the show, and myself, I've learned a lot from Abdul. And until the next one-on-one show, assalamu alaikum and take care.